Welcome to Orthodox Christian Television. My name is Father Christodoulos. We are talking to Dr. Miljan Peter Illich again, and we're discussing Chios, the Island of Saints, Part 4. Welcome, Dr. Illich, again.
Thank you.
We left off in the 5th century when Athens was invading Chios. The former ally of Chios was now attacking its former friend, Chios, and you can pick it up from there.
Well,
This is in the midst, I'm sorry, this is in the midst of the Peloponnesian War, but that's mainly between Athens and Sparta. And Chios decides to rebel against Athens because of Athens's tyranny against Chios. And in, I guess, payment for that rebellion, or I don't want to call it rebellion, it sounds almost illegal, Athens invades Chios and attacks. And now you can pick it up.
Well, in 412 BC, Athens sent a large naval task force with dozens of ships and thousands of men to invade Chios.
Dozens of ships, that's all?
Well, for those days, that was a lot.
But in previous episodes, we talked about the Chian fleet was 150 ships, and the Persians had
100 ships. The Chian fleet was 100 ships.
Persians had 600, and
right.
So dozens is. I guess
well,
things were
they were at this particular time. This was almost a century after what we were speaking about before. The ships were much larger. They had a bigger capacity and more soldiers on them. So in this, at the time of the struggle against the Persians, one ship might have 20 or 30 soldiers on them. At this particular time, almost 100 years later, a ship could have 100 or 200 soldiers on them.
That's a big difference.
So it's a major difference. They were much larger ships and much more firepower on them as well, including new instrumentations and a war. So, and don't forget, Athens was also involved at the same time fighting Sparta in the Peloponnesian War in many other areas, including right next to Athens. There was a Spartan base very close to Athens, and they had been trying to break their way into Athens for many years. The war had, Peloponnesian War had by this time lasted almost 20 years. So there was another factor as well, in that Athens was pretty much exhausted, as was Sparta. And the war had been in a state of balance. And Athens and Sparta, it looked like they would just settle down to have like a balance of power, something like the United States and Russia during the Cold War. Neither one of them could prevail. But the decision of Chios to rebel against Athens, to join the fight against Athens, meant all the difference in the conclusion of the war. As is Socrates, the Athenian historian who lived, by the way, to be 98 years old and died
killed himself.
Well, according to some, he killed himself. According to others, he didn't. But he died about 320 BC.
Socrates.
Socrates.
He took hemlock, didn't he?
No, not Socrates. Socrates.
Oh, Socrates.
Who was, this is a different person, a totally different person. Socrates was an Athenian statesman and historian and philosopher.
Okay, just put an I in front of Socrates.
Okay. And he was a major figure in the, in the world of that time. And he stated in his writings that whichever side Chios joined tended to prevail to win victory at sea because of the power of the Chian navy and the power of Chios. Chios was one of the most powerful city-states in the area. So what happened was that Athens, which had defeated the Persians, felt that it could also defeat the Chians, but it couldn't. It attacked Chios with a large force, and it kept attacking. And they established a base and a fort in Delphinium, in 15 miles north of the city of Chios. And they could...
This is the harbor, the city of Chios is a large harbor, the main harbor, the capital. And the name of the small harbor in the north?
Delphinium.
Delphinium. was where the Athenians attacked.
Where they attacked and they established a fort, and from there they attempted to spread throughout Chios.
They actually established like a beachhead,
they established, well, not only a beachhead, they
fort.
established a base.
a base.
And from there they attempted to spread throughout the island, and they also freed the slaves.
Like a disease.
Chios, strange, perhaps paradoxically, was an area in which the citizens believed in democracy during most of this period. They were very democratic, but it had the second largest slave population in Greece.
Sounds like the...
And next to Sparta, the largest slave population in Greece.
Well, sounds like the United States previous to the Civil War.
Well, something like that. There seems to be something about a country with democratic tradition and slavery coexisting, which makes democracy more valued than in other areas where there is no democratic tradition coexisting with slavery. And
That's interesting. That's interesting.
And this is what happened in Chios. The slaves were freed in Athenian areas, and they actually joined the Athenian forces. So the Athenian troops were reinforced by thousands of freed slaves who they armed and trained, and still they couldn't defeat the Chians. And they resisted them in much of Chios based on the city of Chios, which was fortified again. The Athenians failed to win over the island, but not only were the Chians able to hold on to the city and much of the island, but they managed also to equip new naval forces and an army to fight the Athenian army in other areas, to fight the Athenians in the mainland of Asia Minor, to fight them on the other islands. And most of the Ionian states joined Chios and sided with Sparta at this particular time in the war against Athens, except for Samos, which was a major exception, which very quickly went over to the side of Athens and turned against Chios. And
this is the same island, Samos, that turned against the Chians in the war against the Persians.
That's right, and they did it again, and they allowed the Athenians to establish a major base there. And the main part of you might say, the Eastern Athenian army, as opposed to the Western army, which was facing Sparta on the mainland, became based on Samos. The Navy, Athenian army, and Athenian Navy, the main force became based on Samos, and from there they attempted to, for several years, they kept attacking in different areas, but they failed. So the mighty Athenian wave broke on the rock of Chios, and the result was that there was a revolution in Athens. Actually, the people of Athens were so dissatisfied with what was going on that they were wasting their energy, and they were afraid that they would lose. They were failing to win over the Ionian cities, and they were failing in the west. So they overthrew the government, and they invited Alcibiades to come back to Athens and take over as the leading general of Athens, commander of the forces, which he did. But
so he came back to the people who dishonored him, and how would I say it? They slandered him and accused him, even though he had not been guilty of any of the crimes that he was accused of by the Athenians. So he came back to them.
Right.
And why would he do that? What was the incentive for him?
Well, he was offered the position like commander-in-chief, and also he was always, despite everything, the evidence is that he loved Athens, and the only reason he left was because of the false accusation and the belief that they would actually kill him at this particular time.
So he was loyal to his homeland.
He was loyal to his homeland despite everything, and
well, we can't fault him for that.
But eventually he was expelled again. And
what for this time?
Well, because he lost the battle with the Spartans, and
it's nothing like the gratitude of your countrymen.
Yeah, so they kicked him out again, and he went into exile, where he was eventually assassinated on the orders of the king of Sparta, whose wife he had apparently seduced. So
see the kind of trouble that gets you into, even in the ancient world.
And the upshot of all of this was that Athens basically lost the Peloponnesian War. A large Spartan fleet under Admiral Callicratides.
Say that again?
Callicratides, Spartan admiral, landed in Chios, and the Athenians surrendered or fled. And eventually Athens was actually surrendered to the Spartans about 404 BC.
404?
Yeah,
BC.
By 403, Athens had established a dictatorial government in reaction to its terrible disaster, the Peloponnesian War. It established a dictatorial government in Athens, and Sparta became the leading Greek state, largely due to the influence of Chios on having Ionian states, except for Samos, joined the Spartan side against Athens.
Did Sparta occupy Athens as a...
Sparta basically allowed Athens to have independence. They took some territory, but because the Spartan leadership felt that Athens had contributed so much to Greek culture that it should be treated leniently. Mm-hmm. So it allowed Athens to remain independent.
I guess the Athenians fooled the Spartans into thinking that they had been the ones who contributed so much to Greek culture, when actually it was the Chians.
Well, it was the Chians, but the Athenians consider themselves Ionians, and in fact, if you read Euripides, Ion, in which he describes basically the origin of the Ionians, and it is there revealed that the Athenians are also derived from Iones, who was a son of Apollo, and the others, his other descendants settled the islands of Ionia, and we know from that there was like a love-hate relationship between the Athenians and the Ionians, which continued on through the next century as well, because in the next century, in the 4th century, the Athenians, about 477 BC, established a new confederacy, and this time they promised to behave. And we have a document in which, official Athenian document, which they said, from now on we will not be oppressive to you, we will not settle Athenians.
We'll be good boys, basically?
Well, basically we'll be good boys, and we'll treat everybody who joins us the same way we treat Chios, and Chios was put first as the first example of good treatment by the Athenians. And in fact,
the same way we treat the Chians, we'll treat everybody?
We'll treat everybody, and
but they treated the Chians
well,
badly.
no, the same way we treat the Chians now.
Okay.
You know, because just a few years before that, they signed a special treaty with Chios, in which Chios, by this time, was fed up with Sparta, because the Spartans did the same thing the Athenians did. Leadership turned into empire, empire turned into insolence, and insolence turned into ruin.
What is the saying? Power corrupts absolutely. I guess it's a cycle.
It's a definite cycle, and dictatorial regimes were placed in Athens and in Sparta as well, and Chios kept, for the most part in this period, insisting on democracy for the citizens, not for the slaves.
Well, how can you have democracy for slaves? They wouldn't be slaves if they were part of democracy.
Huge
Come
slave
on now.
population, but still, that's true. You know, still they insisted on democracy. And in fact, Socrates at one time was exiled in the Athenian, from Athens under the Athenian dictatorship. He had to flee for his life, and you know where he fled to?
Wait, Socrates or Socrates?
Is Socrates.
Okay.
Is
fled to
Socrates.
Chios.
He fled to Chios, and he found refuge in Chios for a number of years. He established a philosophical school in Chios and a historical school in Chios. And
probably bought a few slaves.
Well, possibly. And
but wasn't it the Chians who said equal rights for all? Oh no, everyone is equal, but some are more equal.
I don't know if Chians said that.
They could have.
They might have, because it certainly was
I'm just kidding.
How they.
How they thought.
How they looked at things and how they acted.
Well, we have to look at the world in the perspective of the 4th century. I mean, the absolute democracy where every single human being had absolute equality, men and women, slave and non-slave. It was almost impossible to have a civilization without slavery.
Well, in that particular time, I'm not sure if that's correct, but slavery was so well established, no one ever thought of challenging it. It was a fact of life. It was a force of nature. Slavery was as natural as as eating breakfast or anything. No one questioned slavery at all. There were slave revolts. Very few people liked to be slaves, but even those who were unhappy to be slaves, once they were freed, they often enslaved others. So, no,
yes.
it was not something
It's
which
an interesting
seemed
part
unusual.
Interesting part of the human condition.
So what we had in the 4th century, we had the incredible example of Athens reviving again, and here's again helping Athens by the fact that it was the first to join the new Athenian Confederation. It made possible the new revival of Athens and the revival of Athenian culture and the schools of Athens that we value so much right now. This was the time of Plato and...
This is the golden classical era.
A golden classical age of Athens, which was made possible by the fact that Chios joined Athens again and gave Athens another chance at greatness. And Athens again failed the test. Again,
I'm not surprised for some reason.
Athens again, despite its promises in writing, and it's really sad to see. Again, it turned into a dictatorial system. It is specifically against a specific promise not to settle Athenians.
Well, we have it in writing right here. We have it in writing.
It was in writing.
Here it is.
They promised not to settle Athenians in confederate areas would join them. They joined them not as subjects to these city-states like Chios, they joined them as allies. It was a free alliance.
Equal partners.
And yet Athens settled Athenians and started taking over these areas again and establishing another empire.
And how did the Chians react this time?
Chians were among the first
to revolt
again revolt against Athens. And what we have is near the middle of the 4th century, about 357, 355, we have the so-called social war, in which mainly the Ionian states, led by Chios, revolted against Athens to break the Second Athenian Confederation, which really became the Second Athenian Empire. The Second Empire was defeated, and Athens again lost. Again, lost this chance, and this was the last chance that Athens had for greatness. It had greatness, but the last chance for Athens to achieve the old greatness again. It failed again, and from now on, Athens would gradually lose more and more power, and we have the rise of Macedonia.
Is this during the age of Pericles?
No, this was much later. This was...
Pericles was during the Peloponnesian War? No. When was Pericles?
Pericles was well before the Peloponnesian War. Pericles was in the 5th century, during, right after the main fighting, soon after the main fighting with the Persians. After
I always thought Pericles was from the golden age of Athens.
Well, that was the golden age of, that was one of the golden ages. Athens really had several golden ages.
That's why I'm confused.
Athens had a number of golden, this was the last touch of the golden age of Athens.
This is the era of Plato.
The era of Plato.
The last of the great Athenian philosophers.
Right, the era of Aristoteles, and the era of so many other great Athenians. Socrates.
Who?
Is Socrates.
Socrates. Well, we never talked about Socrates.
Socrates was also in the 4th century.
Okay,
Socrates.
So Socrates too. We can't forget
basically, Socrates fought in the Peloponnesian War. And so it was like to the beginning of the 4th, basically around the beginning of the 4th century.
I don't want to bog you down. So now Athens was again defeated for the third time. And
Athens was defeated, and Athens became just a local city with very little influence because Macedonia
was on the rise.
And Macedonian rise was celebrated by one of the greatest of all Chians, who was Pompus, who was born in 378 BC. He wrote a book. It was called Philippica, in which he celebrated the rise of Philip of Macedon. But he was a very unusual person in that he could mix praise and condemnation at the same time. He praised Philip. He said this was the hope for the Greeks, that Philip could unite Europe, that he was the future of Greece. And yet he condemned him as a drunken bum, basically, and his companions as lechers and drunks. So he was...
Well, he meant that with all due respect.
With all due respect, but his writings have been very influential at that time and helped to organize support for Philip. And in fact, for centuries later, they have been the main source of information on the history of the reign of Philip, the father of Alexander.
Now, Philip's son, Alexander the Great, did he ever pass through Chios on his way to conquer the world?
No, as far as we know, he didn't, but we're getting a little ahead of ourselves here. Pompus actually went to the court of Philip of Macedon, so he had a lot of first-hand information, and he attempted to obtain the position of tutor to Alexander because he was a highly respected philosopher and historian. Came close to getting it, then he was beaten out by Aristotle, which annoyed him.
He can't win them all. He can't win them all.
He can't win them all. He annoyed him somewhat, but he did know Alexander personally and become very friendly to Alexander. At this particular time when Pompus was at the court of Alexander, Chios had been temporarily taken over by the Persians again, but indirectly, really more than directly. It was famous Mausoleus, who was of Halicarnassus, who was a
his name was Mausoleus?
Mausoleus. He built he ordered built, and it was completed after his death, what is considered one of the 7 wonders of the world, the Mausoleum in Halicarnassus.
His huge tomb.
Which was built with Greek artistic, architectural, and technological know-how and skill.
Where is Halicarnassus? Where is it?
That's the mainland of Asia Minor.
And this is Mausoleus was a Persian?
He was not a Persian, he was a Carian, which were local people who lived in that area, but he was very much, he was a Hellenizer. He wanted to absorb, he was under Persia. He was like the independent, autonomous ruler of that area under Persia, and he wanted to absorb Greek culture, so he invited Greek scientists, artists, historians, and...
How does it connect to Chios?
Because he established, at this particular time, he established a kind of a domination over Chios. It wasn't a complete conquest, but Chios came under his
sphere of influence,
because Chios had been exhausted by the social war against Athens, and it really had weakened. All the Greek states had been weakened by these continuous wars, and that was one of the things that Pompus was urging, that it was time for the Greeks to stop fighting each other and unite and, frankly, fight the Persians. And he wrote the Hellenica and the Philippica, in which much of that message is clearly to be derived. And it is probable that Alexander himself was influenced by Pompus's ideas about the unity of the Greeks and the conquest of the Persians, because one of the things that he did after his victory over the Persians was that he sent a letter to Chios ordering the recall of exiles like Pompus, especially Pompus, were recalled on the orders of Alexander, and he ordered the removal of the oligarchy in Chios, which had been pro-Persian, basically pro-Carian, but indirectly pro-Persian, and establishing the democracy in Chios. So
reestablishing it.
Reestablishing democracy of Chios, and Pompus came back to Chios, and became one of the leaders of the government in Chios during the rest of the life of Alexander.
Interesting.
And
so now,
and in fact, to show his courage, he was a very courageous person. His principle was more important to him than anything else. And when Alexander the Great was fighting in India, he had left Harpalos, his treasurer in Babylonia, to be like regent of the entire area, which really included Chios as well. And Harpalos, who was a boyhood friend of Alexander, became incredibly corrupt. And he had two of his girlfriends he proclaimed goddesses, and he ordered worship of them and so on. And Theopompus wrote to Alexander complaining against Harpalos, who had all the power of life and death in that area. He sent him a letter telling him that Harpalos was corrupt, that what he was doing, that something should be done about it.
We'll pick this up in our next program. Thank you, Dr. Illich. Thank you for watching Orthodox Christian Television. Please call us or email us with your comments. Thank you. Good night.